On the morning of April 18, 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in his quarters aboard the battleship Yamato, anchored in the calm waters of Hashirajima in Japan's inland sea. The Yamato was the largest warship ever constructed. Her hull displaced 72,000 tons, fully loaded. Her 18-inch guns could hurl shells the weight of a small automobile more than 25 miles. She was, in the spring of 1942, the physical embodiment of Japanese naval power, and the man sitting inside her was the architect of the most devastating surprise attack in modern history. 4 months earlier, Yamamoto had sent his carriers across the Pacific to strike Pearl Harbor. The attack had been his design, his gamble, forced through against the objections of nearly every senior officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy, and it had worked beyond anyone's expectations. The American Pacific Fleet lay wrecked in the mud of Battleship Row. In the weeks that followed, Japanese forces had swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific with a speed that stunned the world. Singapore, the great British fortress, surrendered in February. The Dutch East Indies fell in March. Burma was collapsing. The British Eastern Fleet had been chased from the Indian Ocean. Japan now controlled a defensive perimeter, stretching from the Aleutian Islands in the north to the borders of Australia in the south. An ocean empire larger than any in human history, and every mile of it had been won in fewer than 120 days. Yamamoto had reason to be satisfied, not confident. Satisfaction and confidence were different things in his mind, and that distinction mattered, because Yamamoto understood something about this war that most of the men around him did not. He had lived in America. He had studied at Harvard from 1919 to 1921. He had traveled to the oil fields of Texas and the automobile factories of Detroit. He had played poker and bridge in American parlors and learned to read American faces. And before the war began, he had told Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe, in words that would become the most famous prediction of the Pacific conflict, that if ordered to fight, he would run wild considerably for the first 6 months or a year, but that he had utterly no confidence for the second or third year. 4 months in, the clock was running, and then, sometime around midday, a staff officer brought him a message that stopped the clock entirely. American bombers were over Tokyo. Not a misidentification, not a drill. American twin-engine bombers, 16 of them, were at that moment dropping incendiary bombs and high explosives on the capital of the Japanese Empire, on the city where Emperor Hirohito lived, on the home islands that no foreign power had successfully attacked in the entire recorded history of Japan. Yamamoto's chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, a meticulous diarist who recorded the war's events in a journal later published under the title Fading Victory, noted the day's developments and immediately directed the fleet to pursue the American carriers that had launched the bombers. The pursuit found nothing. The carriers were already gone. But it was Yamamoto's own words in the days that followed that revealed what those 16 aircraft had truly struck. Not Tokyo, not the factories or the docks or the military installations that the bombs had hit. They had struck something far more fragile than steel and far more dangerous to destroy. They had struck the promise that the home islands were untouchable, the promise that the Imperial Japanese Navy's defensive perimeter was impenetrable, the promise that the Emperor himself was safe under the protection of his fleet. Yamamoto said it was a disgrace that the skies over the imperial capital had been defiled without a single enemy plane being shot down. And then, driven by shame, by strategic calculation, and by a gambler's instinct that had always served him before, Yamamoto did something that would cost Japan 4 aircraft carriers, 3,057 men, the finest naval aviators on Earth, and the strategic initiative in the Pacific War. He decided to force a decisive battle at a place called Midway. If this story resonates with you, a like helps it find others who care about this history. And if you are new here, subscribe. There is more to come. Yamamoto was not the only man in Japan shaken by what had happened on April 18. Across the military establishment, from the Naval General Staff in Tokyo to the Army High Command, the Doolittle Raid, named for the American Lieutenant Colonel who led it, landed with a force completely disproportionate to the damage it caused. The physical destruction was minor. Research by historian James M. Scott, drawing on Japanese records, documents that the 16 bombers destroyed 112 buildings, damaged another 53, and killed 87 civilians. 151 people were seriously injured. The military damage was negligible. Not a single Japanese warship was sunk. Not a single airfield was permanently disabled. In purely material terms, it was less consequential than a single night of conventional bombing later in the war. But wars are not fought in purely material terms, and the Doolittle Raid struck at something that material accounting could not measure. For the Japanese military, the defense of the homeland was not merely a strategic obligation, it was a sacred contract. The emperor was considered divine, a living descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. The home islands were the seat of that divinity. And the promise, made implicitly to every Japanese citizen and explicitly within the officer corps, was that the Imperial Navy would never allow a foreign enemy to reach the emperor's skies. The entire justification for Japan's massive naval build-up over the preceding decades rested on this contract. The people had sacrificed so the fleet could protect them. The fleet had promised that no enemy would touch the homeland. On April 18, that promise was broken in broad daylight. 16 American bombers had flown over Tokyo, dropped their bombs, and escaped. Not one was shot down over the capital. The air defense system, which had been designed to intercept high-altitude formations of the kind the Japanese military expected, was caught completely off guard by medium bombers coming in low and fast from an unexpected direction. Japanese fighter pilots scrambled their interceptors, but could not find the attackers in time. Civilians in Tokyo looked up and saw planes with American markings passing overhead. Some initially believed them to be Japanese aircraft on a training exercise. By the time the reality set in, the bombers were gone. The Japanese government moved quickly to suppress the psychological damage. State media dismissed the attack as the do-nothing raid, a futile gesture by a desperate enemy. Censors prevented any discussion of the bombing's success in reaching the capital, but within the military, the truth could not be hidden. The emperor's household had not been directly targeted. The American crews had been ordered to avoid the imperial palace, but the fact remained that enemy aircraft had flown over the city where the emperor lived. For the officer corps, this was not a tactical embarrassment, it was a spiritual failure. The skies above the emperor had been defiled. Officers in the Air Defense Command were reassigned in disgrace. Fighter squadrons that had been deployed to the front lines in the Pacific and Southeast Asia were recalled to the home islands, weakening Japan's forward positions at the very moment when those positions needed to be strengthened. And within the Naval General Staff, the debate that had been simmering since Pearl Harbor about where to strike next was suddenly resolved, not by strategic logic, but by the political imperative of making sure that American bombers could never reach Tokyo again. That resolution would lead directly to the most catastrophic naval battle in Japanese history. But before we follow Yamamoto's decision to its consequences, we need to understand the raid itself. Because the story of how 16 American bombers reached Tokyo is, in its own right, one of the most extraordinary gambles of the Second World War. And it begins not with a general or an admiral, but with a captain on an office staff who happened to look out a window at the right moment. In January of 1942, the United States was reeling. Pearl Harbor had been attacked 6 weeks earlier. The Philippines were falling. Wake Island had surrendered. The Pacific Fleet was crippled, and the American public, stunned by the speed of Japan's advance, was desperate for any sign that the war could be carried to the enemy's doorstep. President Franklin Roosevelt wanted to bomb Japan. The question was how. The answer came from Captain Francis S. Lowe, a submarine officer serving on Admiral Ernest King's staff in Washington. Lowe had been visiting Naval Station Norfolk and noticed something at Chambers Field, the airstrip adjacent to the naval base. Army twin-engine bombers were practicing takeoffs and landings over a section of runway where someone had painted the outline of a carrier flight deck. Lowe looked at the bombers. He looked at the painted outline, and he had an idea that should have been impossible. What if Army bombers could launch from an actual aircraft carrier? It had never been done. Medium bombers like the B-25 Mitchell were not designed for carrier operations. They could not land on a carrier deck. Their wingspan and landing speed made that physically impossible. But they might, with enough modification and enough skill, be able to take off from one if the deck was long enough and the headwind was strong enough. It would be a one-way mission. The bombers would launch, hit their targets, and then fly on to land in China because they could never return to the ship. The pilots would need to accept that from the start. Lowe brought the idea to Admiral King. King brought it to General Henry Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces. Arnold needed a man who could plan the mission, recruit the crews, modify the aircraft, and lead the raid himself. He chose Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle. Doolittle was 45 years old. He held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, one of the very few combat pilots in any air force in the world with an advanced scientific degree. He was the first pilot in history to take off, fly, and land an aircraft entirely on instruments, a feat he accomplished in 1929 that revolutionized aviation and proved that blind flying was possible. He had won the Bendix Trophy, the Thompson Trophy, and virtually every speed record in American aviation. He was also a former racing pilot, a barnstormer, a man who had spent his adult life doing things in airplanes that other pilots considered suicidal and making them look routine. He was, in the estimation of nearly everyone who knew him, the finest pilot in the United States military. And he insisted on leading the raid himself, over the objections of his superiors who considered him too valuable and too senior to risk on what everyone privately acknowledged might be a suicide mission. Doolittle selected volunteer crews from the 17th Bomb Group at Pendleton, Oregon. He did not tell them where they were going. He did not tell them what they would be flying against. He told them only that the mission was extremely dangerous, that it was important to the war effort, and that anyone who wanted to drop out could do so without prejudice. Not a single man dropped out. The crews were sent to Eglin Field in Florida in March of 1942, where they trained for 3 weeks at something no Army pilot had ever practiced, launching a fully loaded B-25 Mitchell in fewer than 500 feet of runway. The B-25 was a medium bomber designed for conventional airfields, with thousands of feet of paved runway. Its normal takeoff roll was well over 1,000 feet. What Doolittle was asking his pilots to do was get a fully loaded bomber weighing more than 15 tons airborne in less than half that distance, from a platform that was itself moving through the ocean and pitching in the waves. The aircraft were stripped of everything that could be removed to save weight. The lower gun turrets were replaced with dummy wooden guns. Additional fuel tanks were installed in the bomb bays and fuselage, rubber bladders that sloshed with aviation gasoline and filled the interiors with fumes. Each plane would carry roughly 1,100 gallons of fuel, enough, in theory, to fly 2,400 miles, if the pilots nursed their throttles and the headwinds cooperated. At Eglin, the pilots learned to hold the brakes, run the engines to full power against the resistance, and release at the precise moment when the airspeed indicator told them they had just enough lift to clear the end of the marked strip. The margin for error was measured in feet, not yards. A Navy pilot named Lieutenant Henry Miller, who understood carrier operations, taught them the technique. By the end of training, every pilot could get his bomber off the ground in the required distance. Whether they could do it from a heaving carrier deck in the open Pacific was a question no one could answer until the moment arrived. On April 1, 1942, 16 modified B-25B Mitchell bombers were loaded onto the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Hornet at Naval Air Station Alameda in San Francisco Bay. The Hornet, commanded by Captain Mark Mitcher, departed the next day as Task Force 18. 11 days later, north of Midway, the Hornet rendezvoused with Vice Admiral William Halsey's Task Force 16, built around the carrier Enterprise. Enterprise would provide fighter cover for both carriers, because the Hornet's flight deck was entirely occupied by the 16 bombers lashed down in 2 rows. There was no room to operate her own aircraft. The combined force steamed west toward Japan under radio silence. The plan called for the bombers to launch on the evening of April 19, approximately 400 miles from the Japanese coast, fly to their targets under cover of darkness, bomb at dawn, and continue west to airfields in eastern China held by Chinese nationalist forces. 400 miles was the outer edge of what the modified B-25s could manage with their extra fuel tanks, and still have enough range to reach the Chinese mainland. But the plan did not survive contact with the enemy. At 7:38 on the morning of April 18, a lookout aboard the Enterprise spotted a small vessel on the horizon. It was the Nito Maru, a converted fishing boat serving as a Japanese naval picket, one of a line of small patrol vessels that Yamamoto himself had stationed in the Pacific as an early warning screen. Japan had no radar. These little boats were the radar. The Nito Maru was roughly 90 tons, 30 meters long, armed with a single heavy machine gun and crewed by fewer than a dozen men. But she carried a radio, and before the cruiser Nashville could close the distance and sink her, which took over 900 rounds of 6-inch shells and strafing from Enterprise aircraft, she broadcast a warning. American carriers sighted. Halsey knew the element of surprise was gone. He also knew that every minute the task force continued west brought it closer to Japanese air bases that could now be alerted. The choice was brutal and immediate. Launch now, 10 hours early, 170 nautical miles farther from Japan than planned, or abandon the mission entirely. Halsey signaled the Hornet, launch planes, to Colonel Doolittle and his gallant command, good luck and God bless you. Doolittle climbed into the cockpit of the lead bomber. The Hornet was pitching in heavy seas. The deck was rain-slicked. He had 467 feet of flight deck ahead of him, and a fully loaded B-25 that weighed more than 31,000 pounds behind him. At 8:20, he released the brakes and roared off the bow of the Hornet into the grey Pacific sky. 15 bombers followed over the next hour. Not one failed to launch. But the early launch changed everything. The extra distance meant the bombers would arrive over Japan in daylight, not darkness. It meant they would burn fuel they could not afford. And it meant that some of them, perhaps many of them, would not have enough range to reach China. The crews knew this. They went anyway. The 16 bombers crossed the Japanese coastline and hit their targets between noon and 1:30 in the afternoon. Doolittle's own aircraft dropped 4 incendiary clusters on a factory complex in northern Tokyo at roughly 1,200 feet. He could see the Imperial Palace and its moat below him. The crews had been given explicit orders not to bomb the palace under any circumstances. They obeyed. Other bombers struck targets in Yokohama, Yokosuka, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and several military and industrial sites across the Tokyo area. Japanese interceptors scrambled but were largely ineffective against the fast, low-flying B-25s. Anti-aircraft fire was disorganized. The air defense system, built to repel high-altitude bombing formations, had no protocol for a handful of medium bombers skimming the rooftops. Within an hour, all 16 bombers had cleared Japanese airspace and were heading west across the East China Sea toward the Chinese coast. 15 of the 16 aircraft ran out of fuel or encountered weather over or off the coast of China and either crash-landed, ditched at sea, or were abandoned by their crews, who bailed out into the darkness over unfamiliar territory. One bomber, piloted by Captain Edward York, whose fuel situation was the most desperate of all due to faulty carburetors that had been secretly replaced before the mission, diverted north and landed near Vladivostok in the Soviet Union, where the crew was interned. The Soviets, officially neutral in the Pacific War, could not release them without provoking Japan. Of the 80 men who flew the mission, 3 were killed. 1, Corporal Leland Factor, died during his bailout over China. 2 others, Sergeant William Dieter and Sergeant Donald Fitzmaurice, drowned when their bomber ditched in the sea off the Chinese coast. 8 were captured by the Japanese. Of those 8, 3, Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, Lieutenant William Farrow, and Sergeant Harold Spatz, were tried by a Japanese military tribunal, sentenced to death, and executed by firing squad outside Shanghai on October 15, 1942. A 4th prisoner, Lieutenant Robert Medder, died of malnutrition and disease in a Japanese prison camp in December of 1943. The remaining 4 survived the war. One of them, Corporal Jacob DeShazer, endured 40 months of captivity, 34 of them in solitary confinement, along with beatings and near starvation. He converted to Christianity during his imprisonment, and he would return to Japan after the war in a role that no one could have predicted. The Chinese people who helped the surviving raiders escape paid a price beyond comprehension. The Japanese military launched the Zhejiang and Jiangxi campaign, a massive punitive operation across the Chinese provinces where the bombers had come down. Villages that had sheltered American airmen were burned. Entire towns were destroyed. According to estimates reported by Major General Claire Chennault and other American officials on the ground in China, the death toll among Chinese civilians from these reprisals reached as high as 250,000. 16 bombers had hit Japan. They had killed 87 people. They had destroyed 112 buildings. And they had set in motion a chain of consequences that would kill hundreds of thousands more on both sides of the Pacific before it was finished. Because in the days and weeks after the raid, aboard the Yamato at Hashirajima, Isoroku Yamamoto made the decision that would define the rest of the war. And to understand why he made it, you need to understand the argument he had been losing for months. Since before Pearl Harbor, there had been a fundamental disagreement at the highest levels of the Imperial Japanese Navy about what to do after the initial conquests were complete. The Naval General Staff in Tokyo, led by Admiral Nagumo, a cautious and methodical man who had also studied at Harvard, favored a conservative strategy. Consolidate the defensive perimeter. Strengthen the positions in the south. Cut Australia off from American supply lines by seizing New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. Let the Americans come to Japan's fortified islands and bleed themselves trying to take them back. Yamamoto disagreed with every part of this plan, and his disagreement went deeper than tactics. It went to the fundamental reality of the war Japan was now fighting. He believed the conservative strategy was suicide in slow motion. He had seen American factories with his own eyes. He had walked the floor of the Ford assembly plant in Detroit, where he watched thousands of automobiles roll off a production line in a single day, at a rate that would have seemed physically impossible to any Japanese industrialist. He had visited the oil fields of Texas and seen the sheer, staggering abundance of the resources that America could bring to bear once its economy shifted to war production. He knew, because he had studied the numbers during his time in Washington, that American shipyards were at that very moment laying the keels of fleet carriers, escort carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, in quantities that Japan could never hope to match. The United States had a gross domestic output roughly 10 times that of Japan. Its steel production was overwhelming. Its oil reserves were effectively unlimited compared to Japan's, which depended entirely on captured fields in the Dutch East Indies. Every month that passed without a decisive battle was a month in which the balance of naval power tilted further toward the United States. Japan's advantage was temporary. It existed now, in the spring of 1942, and it was shrinking with every rivet driven into a hull at the Brooklyn Navy Yard or the Newport News shipbuilding yards. By 1943, the first wave of new American carriers would reach the Pacific. By 1944, there would be so many that no Japanese fleet could stand against them. The window was closing. Yamamoto's plan was to force the Americans into a decisive fleet engagement before their shipyards could replace what had been lost at Pearl Harbor. He wanted to seize Midway Atoll, a tiny pair of islands roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Honolulu. Midway was close enough to Hawaii to threaten Pearl Harbor itself. Its capture would extend Japan's defensive perimeter eastward by more than 1,000 miles. And most importantly, it would force the American carriers, the ones that had escaped Pearl Harbor because they had been at sea on December 7th, to come out and fight. The Naval General Staff resisted. They considered the plan reckless. Midway was too far from Japanese air bases. The supply lines would be impossibly long. The American carriers, wherever they were, could choose not to fight and simply wait for reinforcements. The plan dispersed Japan's forces across thousands of miles of ocean, with the main battle fleet, the Aleutian Diversion Force, the Carrier Strike Force, and the Midway Invasion Force all operating independently, too far apart to support one another. Yamamoto listened to these objections. And then he did what he had done before Pearl Harbor. He threatened to resign. In the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the resignation of the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet would have been a political earthquake. Yamamoto was the most famous naval figure in Japan. His departure would have signaled to the nation that the Naval High Command was divided at the moment of its greatest triumph. Nagano could not allow it. He had capitulated before Pearl Harbor under the same threat. He capitulated again. But it was the Doolittle Raid that broke the last barrier. Before April 18, the Army had flatly refused to provide troops for a Midway operation. After April 18, with the Emperor's capital still figuratively smoking, the Army's objections evaporated. The political imperative of extending the defensive perimeter to ensure that no American bomber could ever reach Tokyo again overrode every strategic calculation. On May 5, 1942, the Imperial General Headquarters issued the order. The Midway operation would proceed. What followed was a masterclass in how overconfidence and emotional decision-making can destroy a plan before it begins. The Midway operation was given to Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same officer who had commanded the carrier strike on Pearl Harbor. Nagumo was a cautious, competent surface warfare officer who had been given command of Japan's carriers largely through seniority rather than any particular affinity for naval aviation. He had 4 fleet carriers for the operation: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. He should have had 6, but the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku of Carrier Division 5 were unavailable. Shokaku had been damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May, and Zuikaku had lost so many aircraft and aircrew in the same battle that she could not be replenished in time. The loss of those 2 carriers reduced Nagumo's striking power by a third. It should have prompted a postponement. It did not. In the first days of May, aboard the Yamato, Yamamoto's staff conducted war games to test the Midway plan. The games were overseen by Yamamoto's chief of staff, Rear Admiral Ugaki. According to an account later published by 2 Japanese officers who were present, Mitsuo Fuchida and Masatake Okumiya, one exercise produced a result that should have given the planners pause. A Japanese officer playing the role of the American commander launched a surprise air attack from Midway against the Japanese carriers. The dice, used to determine the results, produced 9 hits. 2 carriers were ruled sunk. Ugaki intervened. He reduced the result to 3 hits and ruled that only 1 carrier was damaged, not sunk. The sunk carrier was then quietly restored to operational status for the next phase of the games. The officers in the room noticed. Some of them objected privately. None of them objected publicly. The war games continued with the assumption that the plan would succeed. It is worth noting that modern military historians have debated whether Ugaki's ruling was as egregious as it appeared. In the actual battle, American land-based bombers from Midway scored no direct hits on the Japanese carriers, which suggests the dice result was statistically unlikely. But the principle was corrosive. The war games were designed to test the plan's weaknesses. Instead, they were managed to confirm its strengths. The plan emerged from the exercise untested and unchanged. And there was one weakness that no war game addressed, because Yamamoto did not know it existed. In the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor, a team of codebreakers led by Commander Joseph Rochefort was reading Japan's mail. Rochefort was an unusual officer in a navy that rewarded conventional career paths. He was a cryptanalyst, a linguist who spoke fluent Japanese, and a former intelligence operative who had spent 3 years in Tokyo studying Japanese language and culture in the 1920s. He ran the Combat Intelligence Unit, designated Station Hypo, from a windowless basement room in the 14th Naval District headquarters building at Pearl Harbor. The room was cramped, poorly ventilated, and perpetually cold from the air conditioning required to keep the code-breaking machines operational. Rochefort and his team of roughly 40 cryptanalysts, translators, and traffic analysts worked 20-hour days in bathrobes and slippers because the basement was too cold for anything else, and because none of them went home often enough to bother changing into uniforms. The room smelled of stale coffee, pipe tobacco, and the peculiar electrical odor of IBM tabulating machines running day and night. His lead cryptanalyst was Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, a mathematician with an almost supernatural ability to detect patterns in enciphered text. His liaison with Admiral Chester Nimitz's staff was Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, the Pacific Fleet intelligence officer who had the critical task of translating Rochefort's raw intelligence into strategic predictions that Nimitz could act on. By the spring of 1942, Rochefort's team had broken enough of the Japanese Naval Operational Code, designated JN-25B, to piece together fragments of a major upcoming Japanese operation. They could read perhaps 10 to 15% of any given intercept. The rest had to be inferred from context, traffic analysis, and educated guesswork. It was like assembling a jigsaw puzzle where 85% of the pieces were missing, and the picture on the box had been burned. But the fragments they could read kept pointing to the same conclusion. A massive fleet operation was being planned. It involved carriers. It was scheduled for early June, and the target was designated by a 2-letter code, AF. Rochefort was certain AF meant Midway. Naval intelligence in Washington disagreed. Washington believed the target was somewhere in the South Pacific, possibly the Aleutians. The disagreement was fierce and political, and it mattered enormously because Admiral Nimitz had to decide where to position his outnumbered fleet. If Rochefort was right, and Nimitz sent his carriers to Midway, he would have a chance to ambush the Japanese. If Rochefort was wrong, the carriers would be 1,000 miles out of position when the real attack came. To settle the argument, one of Rochefort's officers, Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, devised a deception. He had the garrison at Midway transmit an uncoded radio message, in the clear, reporting that the island's water distillation plant had broken down. Within days, Japanese naval traffic included a message noting that AF was short of fresh water. F was Midway. Rochefort was right. Nimitz made his decision. He would stake everything on Rochefort's analysis. He sent every operational carrier he had to Midway. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a quiet, meticulous surface warfare officer who had never commanded carriers before, took charge of Task Force 16 with the Enterprise and Hornet. Spruance had been recommended for the job by Vice Admiral Halsey himself, when Halsey was hospitalized with a severe skin condition that left him covered in rashes and unable to command. It was an extraordinary choice. Halsey was the Navy's most aggressive carrier admiral. Spruance was his opposite, careful, analytical, a man who calculated before he struck. He would prove to be exactly the right man, at exactly the right moment. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, with the carrier Yorktown, commanded Task Force 17 and held overall tactical authority as the senior officer. The Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea barely 3 weeks earlier. A bomb had penetrated deep into her hull. She was listing and leaking oil. The initial damage estimate called for 3 months in a stateside shipyard. Nimitz could not wait 3 months. He could not wait 3 weeks. He gave the repair crews at Pearl Harbor 72 hours. 1,400 shipyard workers swarmed aboard the Yorktown the moment she entered dry dock. They worked around the clock in shifts, cutting away damaged steel, welding new plates, repairing electrical systems, patching fuel lines, and restoring enough structural integrity to get the carrier back to sea. Some of the repairs were permanent. Many were not. The ship would not survive prolonged punishment, but she could fight. On May 30th, with welding torches still sparking in her lower compartments and civilian workers still aboard, Yorktown steamed out of Pearl Harbor and turned northwest toward the battle that was coming. 3 American carriers against 4 Japanese carriers. Nimitz knew the odds. He also knew something Yamamoto did not know. He knew when the Japanese attack was coming. He knew the approximate direction of approach, he knew the composition of the enemy fleet, and he knew where to position his ships to spring an ambush from the flank. The American carriers took station at a point northeast of Midway designated Point Luck and waited in silence for the Japanese fleet to arrive. On the morning of June 4, 1942, at 4:30, Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway. 108 aircraft, bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters under Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga roared off the flight decks of the 4 carriers and headed southeast toward the atoll. Simultaneously, Nagumo launched 7 search planes to sweep the ocean to the north and east, looking for any American ships that might be in the area. One of those search planes, a float plane from the heavy cruiser Tone, launched approximately 30 minutes late because of a catapult malfunction. That half-hour delay would prove to be one of the most consequential mechanical failures in the history of warfare. Tomonaga's strike hit Midway hard but did not destroy its ability to fight. Around 700, Tomonaga radioed back to Nagumo that a second strike on the island was necessary. Nagumo, who had held his reserve aircraft armed with torpedoes in case American ships appeared, now faced a decision. At 7:15, he ordered the reserve planes rearmed with bombs for a second attack on Midway. The rearming was underway when, at 7:28, the late scout from the Tone reported American surface ships to the northeast. Nagumo froze. The scout's report was maddeningly vague. Surface ships. How many? What type? Were there carriers? The answers came slowly, in fragments, over the next hour. At 8:20, the scout finally confirmed what Nagumo dreaded. There was at least one carrier. Nagumo now faced an impossible choice. His flight decks were chaos. Torpedoes that had been removed from the reserve planes were stacked on the hangar decks because there had not been time to return them to the magazines below. Bombs were being loaded onto aircraft that might need to be rearmed yet again with torpedoes if the scout confirmed carriers. Aviation fuel hoses snaked across the hangar floors. Ordnance carts were jammed between aircraft whose wings nearly touched in the cramped space. The carriers were, at that moment, floating ammunition dumps, their hangars filled with the most volatile combination imaginable: exposed ordnance, open fuel lines, and armed aircraft packed wing to wing. Above all of this, Tomonaga's returning strike planes were low on fuel and circling overhead, waiting to land. Some were damaged, some were wounded. If Nagumo did not recover them soon, they would begin falling into the sea. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2 from the carrier Hiryu, urged Nagumo by signal flag to launch immediately, with whatever was ready, armed or not. "Strike now," Yamaguchi argued, before the American carriers could strike first. Yamaguchi was known throughout the Imperial Navy as its most aggressive carrier commander. Many officers considered him Yamamoto's eventual successor. His advice was to accept the disorder on the decks, put whatever aircraft were armed into the air, and hit the Americans before they could hit him. Nagumo chose caution. He was a surface warfare officer by training and temperament, a man who believed in the coordinated strike, the massed blow, the proper sequence of operations. He decided to recover Tomonaga's planes first, clear the flight decks, rearm everything with torpedoes for an anti-shipping strike, and launch a single overwhelming attack. It was the textbook decision. It was the decision his training demanded, and it required approximately 1 hour to execute. He did not have an hour. He did not have half an hour. He had roughly 45 minutes before the most devastating air attack in naval history arrived overhead. While Nagumo rearmed and recovered, the American carriers had already launched, and the first aircraft to find the Japanese fleet were the torpedo bombers. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, found the Japanese carriers at approximately 9:20. Waldron was a 41-year-old South Dakotan with Sioux ancestry, a veteran naval aviator, and a natural leader who inspired fierce loyalty in his men. The night before the battle, he had gathered his pilots and rear gunners in the Hornet's ready room. He told them plainly that the mission would be dangerous and that some of them might not come back. He told them to write letters home, just in case. He handed out a mimeographed sheet with his final tactical notes and a closing line that read, "If there is only one plane left to make a final run in, I want that man to go in and get a hit." Waldron had disagreed with the Hornet's air group commander, Commander Stanhope Ring, about the heading to find the Japanese fleet. Ring led the fighters and dive bombers on one course. Waldron broke formation and led his torpedo bombers on a different heading, following his instinct. Waldron found the Japanese. Ring did not. But Waldron's 15 Devastator torpedo bombers arrived alone, without the fighter escort they had been promised. The Wildcats that were supposed to protect them had gone with Ring and were circling at high altitude, miles away, looking for an enemy they could not find. The Devastator was already an obsolete aircraft, slow, underpowered, and vulnerable. Without fighter cover, it was a coffin with wings. Waldron led his squadron straight in anyway. The Japanese combat air patrol, dozens of Zero fighters, fell on them from above. Anti-aircraft fire from the carriers and their screening destroyers and cruisers tore through the slow, low-flying Devastators as they droned toward the ships at barely 100 knots. To drop their torpedoes, the pilots had to fly straight and level at close range for what felt like an eternity. One by one, the torpedo bombers were shot apart. Waldron's plane was among the first to fall, hit, and cartwheeling into the sea. All 15 aircraft were destroyed. Not a single torpedo found its mark. One man survived. Ensign George Gay, 25 years old, from Waco, Texas, was shot down near the Japanese fleet. He inflated his life raft, hid under it to avoid being strafed, and floated in the ocean for roughly 30 hours before being rescued. From the water, clinging to a seat cushion, he watched what happened next. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise attacked next. Their commander, Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, was killed. 10 of 14 aircraft were lost, no hits. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown came in after them. Their commander, Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, was killed. 10 of 12 aircraft were lost, no hits. Of 41 torpedo bombers launched by 3 squadrons, only 6 survived. They scored 0 hits on the Japanese fleet. By every measure, the torpedo attacks were a catastrophe. But they accomplished something that no one had planned and no one could have predicted. They pulled the Japanese fighter cover down to sea level. Every Zero in the combat air patrol had descended to chase the torpedo bombers. The skies above the Japanese carriers, at 15,000 feet, were empty. And that is where, at approximately 10:22 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, arrived with 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise. McClusky had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour. He was critically low on fuel. Several of his pilots were already at the point where they would not have enough to return to the Enterprise. His navigation had taken him to the spot where the Japanese carriers should have been based on the morning's intelligence, but the carriers had turned north during the torpedo attacks and were not where he expected them. The ocean below was empty. McClusky faced a choice that would decide the battle and perhaps the war. He could turn back and save his aircraft, or he could keep searching and risk losing his entire squadron to fuel exhaustion. He kept searching. Running out of options, he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, cutting a white wake across the ocean at high speed. The Arashi had been depth charging the American submarine Nautilus for the past hour and was now racing at flank speed to rejoin the fleet. Her wake pointed like an arrow across the open sea. McClusky turned and followed it. It led him straight to 4 Japanese aircraft carriers steaming in a box formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being fueled and armed. McClusky pushed over into his dive. His 2 squadrons, Scouting 6 and Bombing 6, initially both rolled in on Kaga, the largest and most visible target. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading Bombing 6, saw Scouting 6 already committed to Kaga, pulled out of his dive, and redirected his section toward Akagi, Nagumo's flagship. Best and his 2 wingmen screamed down through empty sky, unopposed by a single fighter, and placed a bomb squarely on Akagi's flight deck. It penetrated to the hangar below, where it detonated among the torpedoes and bombs that the rearming crews had stacked there an hour earlier. Akagi erupted. Simultaneously, from the east, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's Bombing 3 from the Yorktown found Soryu and Dove. 3 bombs hit. Soryu was engulfed in flames within minutes. Enterprise's dive bombers tore Kaga apart. In roughly 5 to 6 minutes, beginning about 10:22, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were reduced to blazing, exploding wrecks. The torpedoes and bombs stacked on their hangar decks during Nagumo's rearming turned each ship into a floating ammunition dump. Fires reached aviation fuel stores. Secondary explosions ripped through compartments. Kaga's captain, Jisaku Okada, was killed on his bridge. Soryu's captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, refused to leave his ship. Both carriers sank that evening. Akagi burned through the night. Nagumo transferred his flag to the light cruiser Nagara and watched his flagship die. 1 carrier survived. Hiryu, commanded by Yamaguchi, had been separated from the other 3 by several miles and was not attacked in the initial dive. Yamaguchi launched 2 strikes against the Yorktown that afternoon, crippling her with bombs and torpedoes. But dive bombers from Enterprise, joined by orphaned Yorktown aircraft that had landed aboard after their own carrier was hit, found Hiryu in the late afternoon and hit her with 4 bombs. She burned through the night. In the early hours of June 5, Yamaguchi gathered approximately 800 surviving crew members on the flight deck. He led 3 banzai cheers toward Tokyo. He told his flag captain, Tomeo Kaku, that they would stay with the ship. By tradition, his final words to Kaku as the crew abandoned ship were that they should enjoy the beauty of the moon together. Both men went down with Hiryu when she was scuttled. 300 miles behind his burning carriers, Yamamoto sat aboard the Yamato and absorbed the magnitude of what had happened. He had built the most complex naval operation in Japanese history. He had committed the heart of the combined fleet, 6 battleships, 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and tens of thousands of men, to a plan designed to lure the American fleet into a trap. And the Americans, forewarned by codebreakers working in a basement in Hawaii, had turned the trap around. Yamamoto considered a night surface action. His battleships were the most powerful in the world. If he could close the distance after dark, his guns could destroy the American carriers. But Spruance, cautious, calculating, and fully aware of the risk, withdrew his carriers to the east after sunset. Yamamoto's battleships found nothing but open ocean. In the early hours of June 5, Yamamoto cancelled the Midway invasion and ordered the fleet to withdraw. He took full responsibility for the defeat. He later told his staff that they should never tell anyone outside his inner circle that the submarine force or the First Air Fleet were to blame for the failure at Midway. The failure, he said, was his. The Japanese Navy hid the disaster from its own people. Wounded sailors from the sunken carriers were isolated in hospitals. The names of the lost ships were kept on the active roster. Officers who had survived the battle were transferred to remote posts where they could not speak of what they had seen. The Japanese public would not learn the full truth about Midway until after the war ended. The cost was staggering, and it was permanent. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the core of the Kido Butai, the strike force that had conquered half the Pacific in 6 months. She lost the heavy cruiser Mikuma, sunk by air attack during the Japanese retreat. She lost 3,057 men, but the loss that mattered most, the loss that could never be replaced, and that broke the trajectory of the entire war, was the aircrew. Japan's system for training naval aviators was fundamentally different from the American system. It was slow, brutally selective, and designed to produce a small number of supremely skilled pilots rather than the vast numbers that American flight schools were churning out. A Japanese naval aviator might train for 2 or 3 years before being assigned to a carrier. He was considered a national treasure, an asset whose skills had been honed to a level that no short training program could replicate. There was no mechanism in the Japanese system for rapid replacement. The training pipeline was narrow, the instructors were few, and the standards were uncompromising. The men who died at Midway were not just pilots. They were the formation leaders, the combat veterans, the men who had bombed Pearl Harbor and struck Darwin and Ceylon. They were the irreplaceable core of Japanese naval aviation, and they were also the men who would have trained the next generation of carrier pilots. When they went into the sea with their ships, the future of Japanese naval air power went with them. Japan would build new carriers. She would train new pilots. But the pilots who replaced the dead would never reach the skill level of the men they replaced, because the men who could have taught them were gone. The United States lost the carrier Yorktown and the destroyer Hamon, both sunk by the Japanese submarine 168 in the days after the battle. 307 Americans were killed. The losses were grievous, but American shipyards were already building the Essex-class carriers that would flood the Pacific within 18 months. American flight schools were training thousands of new pilots every month. The industrial machine that Yamamoto had feared, the one he had seen with his own eyes in Detroit and Texas, was doing exactly what he had predicted it would do. Midway did not end the war, but it ended Japan's chance of winning it. The 6 months that Yamamoto had predicted were up, and now, the symmetry that makes this story unlike any other in the Pacific War. April 18, 1942. 16 American bombers hit Tokyo. The raid did almost nothing militarily, but it shattered something irreplaceable in the Japanese strategic mind. It gave Yamamoto the leverage to force through his Midway gamble. The gamble failed. 4 carriers burned. The war turned. April 18, 1943. Exactly 1 year later. American codebreakers, the same code-breaking apparatus that had revealed the Midway plan, intercepted a Japanese signal detailing Admiral Yamamoto's upcoming inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. The message included his complete itinerary, his departure time, his arrival time, and the type of aircraft he would be flying in, a Mitsubishi G4M medium bomber. The intelligence reached Admiral Nimitz. Nimitz sent it to Washington. The question was whether to act on it. Killing an enemy commander-in-chief was without precedent in modern American warfare. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox approved the mission. Some accounts credit Roosevelt himself with the final authorization. On the morning of April 18, 1943, 18 P-38, Lightning fighters from the 339th Fighter Squadron of the 347th Fighter Group launched from Guadalcanal. 2 turned back with mechanical trouble. The remaining 16 flew at wave-top level for more than 400 miles to avoid Japanese radar, a flight of over 2 hours on a precise intercept course calculated to the minute. Over the jungle of Bougainville, they found Yamamoto's bomber exactly where the codebreakers said it would be. The P-38s attacked. Yamamoto's G4M was hit and crashed into the jungle. When Japanese search parties found the wreckage the next day, they reported that Yamamoto's body was still in his seat, his hand resting on the hilt of his katana. He had been killed by gunfire that entered the fuselage. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor, who had gambled on Midway, who had understood better than anyone in the Japanese high command what America was capable of, and who went to war against her anyway, was dead at the age of 59. He was killed on the first anniversary of the raid that had sealed his fate. Jimmy Doolittle, the man who led those 16 bombers off the Hornet's deck, survived the war. He had expected a court-martial for losing every one of his aircraft. Instead, he received the Medal of Honor from President Roosevelt and was promoted 2 grades to Brigadier General. He went on to command the 12th Air Force in North Africa, the 15th Air Force in the Mediterranean, and the 8th Air Force in Europe, the largest strategic bombing force in history. He retired as a lieutenant general. In 1985, Congress promoted him to full 4-star general on the retired list. He lived to the age of 96, dying in 1993. George Gay, the young ensign from Texas who floated in the Pacific Ocean and watched the Japanese carriers burn, was rescued after 30 hours in the water. He became a celebrity briefly, then returned to flying. After the war, he became a pilot for TWA and later ran a charter service in Texas. When he died in 1994, his ashes were scattered at sea over the coordinates where Torpedo Squadron 8 had gone down, returned at last to the men he had watched fall. Joseph Rochefort, the codebreaker whose basement team had made the American victory possible, received no recognition at the time. Washington intelligence officials, embarrassed that Rochefort had been right and they had been wrong about the identity of AF, blocked his nomination for the Distinguished Service Medal. He was reassigned to a floating dry dock in San Francisco, a posting so obscure it was widely understood as punishment. Rochefort never publicly complained. He died in 1976. A decade after his death, the Navy finally awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal, and the President of the United States awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He never saw either one. Richard Best, who dove on Akagi in the morning and flew again against Hiryu that afternoon, flew his last combat mission on June 4. A faulty oxygen system in his SBD had been feeding him caustic soda fumes instead of air throughout the battle. Within weeks, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, almost certainly triggered by the chemical damage to his lungs. He was grounded at the age of 32 and never flew again. After nearly 2 years of treatment, the Navy medically retired him in March of 1944, a decorated hero whose war lasted exactly 1 day of combat flying. He lived until 2001, dying at the age of 91. Jacob DeShazer, the Doolittle Raider who survived 40 months of Japanese captivity, returned to Japan in 1948 as a Free Methodist missionary. He spent more than 30 years there, preaching in the country that had imprisoned and tortured him. Among the Japanese people who read a pamphlet DeShazer had written about his imprisonment and conversion was Mitsuo Fuchida, the pilot who had led the first wave of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Fuchida sought out DeShazer, converted to Christianity, and spent the rest of his life speaking about reconciliation between Japan and America. Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, who had overruled the wargame umpire at Hashirajima, survived the Battle of Midway and the rest of the war. On August 15, 1945, the day Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, Ugaki climbed into a dive bomber at Oita Airfield and flew a final kamikaze mission toward Okinawa. He was never seen again. His diary, recovered and published after the war, remains one of the most detailed Japanese accounts of the Pacific conflict. There is a question buried inside this story that is worth sitting with. How does a raid that destroyed 112 buildings change the course of a war? The answer is not in the buildings. It is not in the 87 people killed or the factories damaged, or the small fires that burned out in an afternoon. The answer is in what the raid revealed about the men who received it. Yamamoto was, by almost any measure, the most brilliant naval strategist Japan produced in the 20th century. He understood American industrial power better than any officer in the Japanese military. He knew the war was unwinnable in the long run. And yet, when 16 bombers appeared over Tokyo, he reacted not with the cold calculation that had produced Pearl Harbor, but with something older and less rational. He reacted with the need to make sure it could never happen again. That need overrode his own strategic judgment. It silenced the objections of his peers. It committed the best ships and the best men in the Japanese Navy to a battle they did not need to fight, at a place that did not matter, on a timetable driven not by military logic, but by wounded pride. The Doolittle Raid did not defeat Japan. Midway did not defeat Japan. What defeated Japan was the thing Yamamoto himself had identified before the war began, the vast, irresistible weight of American industrial and military power that no single battle could overcome. But Midway accelerated that defeat by years. It stripped Japan of the carriers and the pilots she needed to hold her perimeter. And Midway happened because 16 bombers, launched from a carrier pitching in heavy seas by a former racing pilot with a doctorate in aeronautics, flew over Tokyo on a spring afternoon and broke something in the mind of the one man who had the power to send the Japanese fleet into a trap. Yamamoto had been right about America. He had been right about the 6 months. He had been right about the vast industrial machine that would bury Japan under steel and fire if given enough time. He was right about all of it, and none of it saved him, because being right about your enemy is not enough if you cannot govern your own response when that enemy strikes back. 16 bombers, 80 men, 112 buildings, and 4 aircraft carriers at the bottom of the Pacific. That is what happened after American bombers reached Tokyo. Now you know why it led to Midway. Thank you for staying with this story. If it reached you, a like is the single best way to help it find others who care about this history. If you have not yet subscribed, now is a good time. And the bell makes sure you never miss one of these. I would love to know where you are watching from today. And if someone in your family served in the Pacific, in the air, on the water, or on the islands, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men and women carried a story that deserves to be heard. This is how we make sure they are remembered.